presents on football, the world game beyond borders. Please welcome Les Murray.
Thank you, Ahmed. I thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity, and I thank all of you for coming today. I didn't know much about the Affinity International Foundation until we had a cup of tea together just now, so I'm very impressed with the work that they do. I was at a lunch yesterday where the keynote speaker was Frank Lowy. This great achiever who left Hungary as a teenage refugee after the Second World War spoke eloquently about and with passion about his two loves and the two areas in his life, in his story, which will be the mementos to his life: his business, the Westfield shopping empire, and football. And I couldn't help seeing in his words and his body language the glint in his eye that it was his achievement in football that gave him the most pleasure and the most pride. And I wasn't surprised by that, for it was through football and not through the billions he gathered by building shopping centres that Frank truly became an Australian. This was my experience too, for it was through football that I found my Australianness, and it was thanks to football and its immense power as a unifier of people, as a license for assimilation and acceptance, that I found my place in Australian society. I will talk more about that anecdotally in a moment, but let me begin at the start of this story and why football and I have always lived in a parallel universe, and how the beautiful game helped shape my life. On a cold December night in 1956, my family of two parents, two brothers, and I became displaced persons after crossing the border from Hungary to Austria as refugees. It was a dangerous exercise. The penalty in Hungary for trying to escape was 5 years in jail, and our people smuggler, and we did have one, would have been hanged had he been caught. We escaped in an effort to seek freedom from oppression and poverty after a popular revolution against dictatorship and subjugation was crushed by the Soviet tanks, and my parents had lost all hope. After we crossed the border, nobody tried to turn us back, nobody called us illegal, nobody tried to ship us off to Cyprus or Malta for offshore processing. The first Austrian we confronted after arriving in his country said to us, "Well, welcome, you are free." I mention this to give context to the circumstances of refugees and asylum seekers, and that they are never ever a threat to their country and destination. By this time, and I was just 11 years old, football was already very much with me as part of my DNA, part of my luggage, as was the case with most Europeans at that time. We spent 6 months in Austrian refugee camps, which were clean and comfortable, camps we were free to leave at any time we wanted, provided we returned to them. They were not detention centres. After being processed by the Austrian authorities, we were welcomed to Australia. Australia struck me as a very beautiful, very free country, but a bit strange. I remember the first Australian I confronted when our plane load with its load of refugees landed in Darwin. And as I was walking into the terminal after we got off the plane, there was this tall, spindly guy there with a Cobra hat, white shirt, short sleeves, tie, Bermuda shorts, and socks. And he was rolling a cigarette. And I looked up at him, and he looked down at me and went, "Hey again." I said to my father, "What kind of a country is this?" For a start, this land of milk and honey, in this land of milk and honey, they can't even afford ready-made cigarettes. Anyway, so Australia struck me, that was my first impression of Australia, but there were some other surprises to come, the biggest of them being that it was not a football country. I was absolutely shocked by this. I was shocked to learn that what Australians called football was played with a ball the shape of an egg. I had no idea a country like this existed anywhere in the world where football was not the national pastime. So from that moment, even before I could speak the language, I embarked on a mission to change that. And I'm still on that mission today, you may have noticed. When it came to football, I had no need to learn English because football, more than any other, is the universal language. You don't need to speak Italian to watch a football match in Italy. And you don't need to speak the language of an African in order to play football with him or against him. This is the first reality that makes football such a unifying force. If two people from vastly different tribes and cultures share an equal love for football, they are already on the same wavelength. They are already soulmates. And in the 1950s, in the middle of the biggest migrant boom in our history, it was in the language of football that the myriad of different migrant groups began to speak to each other. This era marked a revolution in football in Australia of monumental proportions, the beginning of a seismic shift in Australian sporting culture, the effects of which the country is still feeling today, and whose legacy will go on long, long into the future. It was born out of a clash between the needs and rights of an energetic, vibrant, burgeoning migrant community and its conservative host, who had no interest in and only resisted change. On the one side were the migrants with their love of football and their urge to play it and have it enjoyed by the wide community, their baggage. On the other side were the little Aussie soldiers clad in blue blazers who ran the game in a country where it had languished as a minority game of only peripheral interest and subservient to the rugby codes, Aussie rules and cricket, since the game first took root in the 1880s. This was, I'm talking the late 1950s. Migrant young men, teeming by now and eager to play, were often refused a registration by suburban clubs who wanted no part of the Wogs. As a result of such resistance, and driven by the need to take care of their own, the migrant communities formed their own football clubs and entered them in lower tier competitions. Manned by immigrant players who were technically superior to the locals, these clubs swiftly climbed up the various divisions and were soon knocking on the doors of the most elite levels. Moreover, their games were being watched by bulging crowds of partisan immigrants, representing a commercial opportunity the game in Australia had scarcely experienced before. Inevitably, the bubble had to burst, and the force between the migrant-driven boom and those who were resisting it had to come down to a showdown. With neither side willing to give way, it resulted in a breakaway. The bubble burst in 1956 when Walter Sternberg, president of HACOA, the club of Sydney's Jewish community, convened a meeting of representatives from the disaffected clubs at his house in the Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill. The issue that brought things to a head was the obstinacy of the established order, which stonewalled the rise of the new migrant community clubs by blocking their promotion into the New South Wales First Division. HACOA won the second division title that year, but it was denied promotion to the top tier on the argument that it didn't represent the district. HACOA, playing bright, high-quality football, attracting healthy, boisterous crowds in the second division and bringing new money into the game, was barred from the top table. North Shore, a club called North Shore, finishing last in the first division after being hammered from pillar to post by everybody and attracting meagre attendance of a few hundred, but representing a district who were not seen fit for relegation. Now this was just about enough for Sternberg, and at the meeting at his home, 10 clubs, which included 5 district clubs with no ethnic community affiliation, signed a document declaring the formation of the New South Wales Federation of Soccer Clubs. The new league would start in 1957, just weeks later with much excitement and vibrancy. After a short war between the new body and the old New South Wales Soccer Association, the old order met its inevitable demise. So the breakaway was a success. What happened in 1956 at Sternberg's house was a landmark moment in football's development and evolution within Australian society. Though the first recorded football match in Australia took place in 1880, To many historians, 1956 is regarded as the year dot in the process that led to football's coming of age and Australia's final entrance into the global football church, which we are enjoying today. The people who are principally responsible for this, and frankly need to be thanked for it, are the migrants. It was their work, tireless and mostly thankless, that led by social osmosis to the supposition and ultimate acceptance that football was an avenue by which Australians could become truly relevant in the world. It was through football that migrants left a major imprint on Australian social development, and how they did this and why needs to be understood. The first football match I attended in Australia was in 1958, not long after I had arrived as an immigrant. I was 12 and the match was between Corriwall and a team called Budapest, played at Memorial Park, Corriwall's home venue on the New South Wales south coast. The crowd around the modest suburban pitch would have been around 3,000, but bustling, loud and alive. I would reckon at least half were Hungarians. It was the largest gathering of Hungarians I had been among since leaving the old country. It was for that brief couple of hours like being at home. And therein lies the predominant reason why so many migrant communities formed their own football clubs in the middle of the 20th century. The popular folklore is that, it certainly was at that time, that ethnic communities form enclaves or ghettos, which include sporting clubs, because they deliberately want to recreate semblances of their homeland, ring-fence themselves off from the rest of the host society and avoid assimilation. This is uneducated nonsense. By nature, immigrants, at least in the immediate period after their arrival, need to be with each other in order to soften the difficulties and hostilities of migration. In order to survive, they need to associate with people who speak their language, follow their customs, and trade in the things they need. For example, for years after their arrival in Australia, my parents consulted Hungarian doctors, Hungarian dentists, bought their groceries from a Hungarian grocer, their meat from a Hungarian butcher, and had their shoes repaired by a Hungarian cobbler. Football clubs were formed by the migrants at the outset in order to provide an outlet for the young men from their communities to play sport. But as spectators and supporters came, hungry for their football, the clubs, and in particular their games, became a weekend respite from the toils they were experiencing during the week in their efforts to settle into a foreign society. So far from slowing down the process of assimilation, the ethnic clubs actually assisted it. This is why these clubs ultimately saw their followings drop away, and many of the clubs have since disappeared. Their fans had assimilated and had no need for these weekend rituals any longer. So the ethnic clubs, many of them in the natural evolutionary process, died a natural death. It is instructive that clubs formed by British migrants, and there was the odd one, were among the least successful, certainly in terms of the size of their fan bases. This was because their originating culture, including language, was not too dissimilar to Australia's, and migrants from Britain were the quickest to settle into Australia's predominantly Anglo-Celtic culture. But for me, the sense of Australianness through football was yet to arrive. That came with the birth of the Socceroos in the mid-1960s. Some bright spark at the Australian Soccer Federation came up with the idea that Australia should enter a team in the FIFA World Cup, something it had never ever done before. So now, all the football-loving people in the country, most of whom were from ethnic communities, had the one team, an Australian team, to support. It was a masterstroke. But the opportunity to truly experience that, for me, didn't come until 1969, when Australia played its first World Cup qualifier at home, a final game showdown against Israel in Sydney. The date was the 14th of December 1969, an agreeable summer's evening in Sydney. The venue was the Sydney Sports Ground on the land where the Sydney Football Stadium now sits, bulging with a 33,000 capacity crowd, again most of them first-generation immigrants. I was among them for the first time at the age of 24 and a dozen years after migrating. I felt truly Australian. It was the first time that I felt truly Australian. Prior to that, the only games at which I felt any emotion were those played by the club I supported, my beloved St George Budapest, because Budapest had a Hungarian heritage, the same as mine. The international games I attended had been primarily out of curiosity up until now. But now, suddenly, like most football fans around the world, I had a second team, that of my country. What fueled this new emotion was not just a sense of belonging, but a sense of belonging through the medium of football, itself an element of the culture I brought with me as an immigrant. There may have been 2,000 or 3,000 Jewish immigrants in the stadium that day, whose heart beat for Israel, but the vast majority were newcomers from other lands, now united through football by their support for a team representing their new homeland. It was as graphic and powerful a demonstration as one could get, and that I have seen, of football's capacity to act as a catalyst for national unity. The rainbow makeup of the spectators was mirrored by the team they were barracking for, a starting 11 whose backgrounds were Australian, English, Scottish, German, Hungarian and Croatian. Australia only drew that match with Israel and failed to make it to the big stage. But 4 years later, in another landmark moment, Australia qualified for the World Cup for the very first time. And in one of the qualifying games for that World Cup, football delivered another historic moment for our country. For the qualifier in Sydney against Iraq, the President of the Australian Soccer Federation, Sir Arthur George, invited the popular, then recently elected Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. No Australian Prime Minister had ever attended a football match in an official capacity before. Whitlam agreed, but on one condition. He said, "I'll come, provided that the anthem played before the game to represent Australia is not God Save the Queen, but Advance Australia Fair." Sir Arthur agreed to the deal, and for the first time at a sporting event, Advance Australia Fair was played 11 years before it was adopted officially as Australia's national anthem. Today, 40 years on, football, of course, is in a very different place. It's in a much loftier place. We now have a vibrant professional league. Our game is part of Asia. The Socceroos have qualified for 3 World Cups in a row, and next January we are hosting the Asian Cup. But the game is still being led by an immigrant, a former Hungarian refugee named Frank Lowy. His era will pass, of course, and that comes in November 2015, when his last eligible term as chairman of Football Federation Australia comes to an end. But the legacy of the migrants in building the world game in Australia will linger for the next 1,000 years. This wonderful story is proof again that football's capacity to conquer new lands is rooted in one thing, that it is truly a game without borders.